Hello everyone, my name is Paul. Welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic day. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. There's a ton of stuff happening all throughout the world today, as I'm sure you can tell on the map, especially inside of the country of Ukraine, where a war has been currently ongoing since February the 24th of 2022. And when it comes to most of these news stories, generally speaking, what's happening? Well, it's not very good. It's a lot of really bad things. There's a lot of human suffering as a result of many of these news stories tonight. And as always, we are here to be the news that gives back. And the way that we're able to do that is through you guys. 100% of everything we do here at the New News is charity driven. We will never be monetizing this for personal gain. We'll never be merchandising. We'll never be doing anything like that. No super chats. 100% of everything we do here is charity driven. So please check out the video description below. And you will find a ton of different organizations down there, all of them vetted by us. And we are always looking to add more to that list. And 70% or more of the donations that those organizations receive go directly to their partners, meaning they go directly to helping people, those in need, and with 30% or less going to things like the salaries and administration's costs to keep those organizations running. And so if you can't give a lot to those organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. One of the biggest things that people can do to help us is to help us grow our impact, help us grow this channel. The more people that come here and watch the news, and see what's happening in the world around them, the more people that will be here to donate, the more people that will come to the understanding of what's happening in the world, and the more good overall we'll be able to do by bringing awareness to these situations and providing the opportunity to help the people that are affected by them. And at some point, should enough people like and subscribe these videos and streams and share our content, hopefully at some point we'll be able to put a fundraiser on every single stream that we do and every single video that we release to continually try and help people in a more direct way than what we're able to do now. And we hope to see these projects continue to grow and expand as we continue to grow as an organization and as a team and as a wonderful, wonderful community. So thank you to those that have already supported us, and thank you to those that continue to come back here every single day, and even more of a thank you for supporting the wonderful organizations in the description below. If you have more, please reach out to a staff member, send us a link in a short description of what your organization does, and we would love to get that added onto our stream once it completes that vetting process. Now, as we get ready to roll here and into the news, a lot of the stuff, unfortunately, has to do with conflicts, terrorism, things like that. And a lot of the stuff can be rather confusing when we're talking about some of the bigger picture stuff or how some of this stuff works. And so if you have a question and you're joining live tonight, please feel free to ask a question inside of the live chat tonight. I am watching the live chat, as I am every single night. Hello, everyone, by the way. And I will do my best to answer them right here on stream live. And to give you a little bit of a background on myself, for those that may be new here, I served in the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020. I served as an O-352 anti-tank missileman and a corporal with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. During my time in the Marine Corps, I did end up going to the Middle East twice. My first tour to the Middle East was between October of 2017 and March of 2018. There, I was part of Operation Inherent Resolve, and I spent about a month and a half in transit in Kuwait before going to Syria as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. I was there with Special Operations Forces and fought against the Islamic State, of course, but also provided security measures and tried to do stabilization efforts there in the northeastern part of the country, mostly Deir ez-Zor and Al-Hasaka provinces. Came back home to the U.S., ran an armory for about 2.5 years in my unit before returning back to the Middle East. This time I was the Javelin team leader for the Crisis Response Company out of Kuwait. In the years of 2020, I ended up going to the Baghdad Embassy complex. I oversaw all anti-arm operations over the Baghdad Embassy complex there before rotating down into the Red Sea there in Saudi Arabia and training Saudi Arabian Marines. I'm a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine, but I'm also a fully cross-trained machine gunner, a fully cross-trained rifleman, a partially cross-trained radio operator, as well as a CLS or Combat Lifesaver Certified Marine, meaning I do have additional medical training on top of what other Marines will receive, and I do have real-world experience providing aid to real casualties, specifically in my time in Syria. Outside of that, I try to remain well-rounded. I'm not an expert, but I am interested in history, geopolitics, human geography, and the likes. But it doesn't matter, because I implore that you, as a viewer, please do your own research. And if you would like a starting point, any of our maps, including this one tonight, is available on our website, also linked in the description below. You guys can go and check them out, follow along, and they're also documented all the way back until when we started the channel last year. And so with that, I hope that we can, I hope that you guys will ask a lot of great questions. I always like getting questions and answering them to quite an interesting degree. Sometimes a little bit longer, maybe I should. But we jump right here into our news stories as we begin the night tonight, and jumping down here and into Ukraine, where the first topic of the night is a little insight into Ukrainian combat training. So Ukrainian troops do continue to undergo very intense combat training as they prepare to go into the front lines here. And I thought this was a very interesting video, so did the other researchers in the team, because it kind of illustrates certain aspects, and I'll kind of go into that. So why is this guy just screaming at this kid? Like, what is the purpose of this? And you see it in other things too. In my time in the Marine Corps, very famously in boot camp, everyone gets chewed out, but that doesn't stop. In fact, probably boot camp for me and for a lot of people in the Marine Corps was really the easiest part of the Marine Corps. Because it only gets worse. You just get, it's not that it gets easier, it continuously gets harder, but you become accustomed to how hard it is. And that's the whole point of this, is building that stress level, building that capability up of being able to continue doing a task under stress. And believe it or not, yelling at people and getting in their face and just screaming at them and spitting all over them, essentially, when you're doing so, is a really great way to add stress to an environment in a training. So I used to do this to juniors all the time. Being an NCO, it was kind of the job. But when you're doing things like gun drills and you're doing this repetitive, very physical thing, you're lugging around that 50 cal, you're sprinting with it, you have all your gear on, and you're trying to set up the gun. Someone is screaming at you. You know, you're trying to do very technical things sometimes, and trying to, you know, put the pedal pin on and get it in the cradle and get it into the tripod or whatever you're trying to do, and then you're trying to load it and trying to make sure it's clear. It's a lot of small, minute details that you have to be able to do it as if it's second nature. It shouldn't be a question of how to do it. I shouldn't at any point in time forget to rack the 50 cal a second time. It should be second nature. There shouldn't be any question if there's a round in the chamber. Half load, full load, go. Right? My adjustments on the T&E, 10 up, 10 down, 5 up, 5 down. Minor adjustments left and right. My traverse and elevation bar doesn't matter. I should be able to do it like it's second nature. And I should be able to do it when getting screamed at, but even more so, I should be able to do it when I'm under fire. And that's the whole point. You don't start by immediately just like shooting, at somebody and thinking everything's going to be okay. Most people can't handle that stress. They can't handle that level of stress. And that's why you see such really bad fatigue from people that have no training. And so you have to build up to that. And that's part of the reason why you scream at people. You want to instill that stress in a safe way. You want to get them used to dealing with stress and building upon that stress. He's just crawling around here. None of what he's doing is particularly hard, but this guy hates his life because he's crawling around in the sand and he's getting yelled at the whole time. Which nothing he's doing is incredibly hard to do. His pack might be a little heavy, he's a little dirty, he's a little uncomfortable, but none of it is particularly a hard task. But he's stressing out, which makes it mentally much more difficult. And something I've learned over my time is that your mind is going to give out much faster than your body ever will. So that's one of the major reasons for doing this. It's a very important aspect of training. It's something that I wholeheartedly agree with. Some some methods are definitely not okay. There's definitely a point between, it's a fine line, I will say that, but there's definitely a point where there's a difference between very good training and preparing somebody for useful skills and having a point to what you're doing, and hazing somebody, which is not an okay thing, and I do not agree with it. But there is definitely a point. There's definitely a point where there is good training, but there is also a hazing. This is definitely just good training. So, and some people may disagree to include command in the armed forces. I don't disagree with that, but there's a line, but it's really making sure that it has a purpose. What you should be doing has a purpose, and that certainly does. So, kind of a cool aspect. We don't really get to see the training behind the scenes of what's going on very often, and it's kind of an interesting topic to talk about, because we talk about combat effectiveness, but there's stuff that leads up to somebody being capable of, effectively putting hate and discontent downrange. It's not an overnight process. Hand them a rifle, you're probably not going to fare nearly as well as I am. And generally speaking, most people watching this will not fare very well as I would in the same situation, because I have that capability. I have that stress level built up. Unfortunately, we do have the solemn duty, once again, of reporting the child casualty update. This time it's coming from the press service of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights. And they said, quote, "Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 464 Ukrainian children have died, 934 children have been injured. Most victims among children are from the Donetsk region. Moreover, 366 Ukrainian children were reported missing, and 16,226 were deported." Once again, the forced deportation of children from a group to another group to include along national lines, as what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, is actually considered a crime of genocide under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, as well as the 1993 Rome Statute. We also have an EOD update. EOD standing for Explosive Ordnance Disposal, coming from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, talking about their demining efforts. Quote, "Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, Ukrainian sappers have defused 332,030 explosive items, to include 2,191 aerial bombs." Once again, coming from the press service of the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And we do actually get from the Ministry of Internal Affairs a little bit of talking about this. This will be an effort that takes forever. And as we can see here, just even small shells. This looks like a 25 millimeter shell, probably a 23 millimeter shell in truth. Well, this is an explosive item he's found, right? And equally could be as dangerous, right? Artillery shells, as we can see there, just laying all over the place. These kinds of things are just inherently dangerous, and they're unstable. And it takes quite a lot of effort. It takes forever for EOD to do anything, no matter how simple it may seem, of a job. It's extremely unstable. It's inherently dangerous, and so it takes a very long time for them just to go through a very small amount, very, very small sectors of land. They measure this in hectares. They don't even measure it in full acres. They measure it they measure it not in square miles or square kilometers, but hectares of land that they are going through, and finding an immense amount of explosives in that area. Ammunition, rockets, artillery, what have you, are just everywhere, and it's a horrendous thing to do. And there's a lot more to come. This will be something that affects Ukraine for decades going forward into the future, and every single day of combat is only going to make that situation worse. So it's definitely something good to get an update on, and it should tell you, 332,000 explosive items is not a very small number at all, and that honestly probably isn't even a vast majority of the land that they still have to survey. And this will take hundreds of thousands of hours of work to do going forward, and that is with help. An update that we have here is that Ukraine has positively identified the soldier who was executed on video. And Glory to Ukraine were the last words of Alexander Matsievsky, a sniper of the 119th Territorial Defense Brigade. After being forced to dig his own shallow grave, he was allowed by his captors, the notorious Wagner Group, or Wagner Group, more proper, to smoke a cigarette. When one of the perpetrators stated that they were filming, Alexander turned to the camera and stated "Slava Ukraine." Before being gunned down by several other Russian soldiers, he was killed near instantly. After days of rumors regarding the man's identity, the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces did positively identify him as Alexander Matsievsky, and he had been serving around Bakhmut at the time of his capture during the intense fighting. The Ministry of Defense and President Zelensky confirmed the reports of the Territorial Defense Forces, with Zelensky posthumously awarding Mr. Matsievsky with the title of Hero of Ukraine. And this is coming from President Zelensky himself here on his official Twitter. I confer the title of the Hero of Ukraine upon Alexander Matsievsky, a Ukrainian warrior, a man who will be known and remembered forever for his bravery, for his confidence in Ukraine, and for his glory to Ukraine. Glory to the hero, glory to the heroes, and glory to Ukraine. And that is the man himself. Once again, also further identified from the actual Ukraine Territorial Defense. Moving over here and into the border area here in the Sumy Oblast, coming out of Velkia Piasorivka in the Sumy Oblast. Both Bilopilia and Velkia Piasorivka were shelled on the 11th using by mortars and grenade launchers by the Russian forces right across the border. There are rumors of casualties, though we do not have a lot of information on it. That immediately brings us there and into the Dunbas, where we get to see what's going on in the most kinetic sector of the front lines. Now, our first stop here is just outside the city of Kramatorsk, which is acting as the de facto head of government for Ukrainian-controlled territory in the Donetsk region. And this is the latest daily Donetsk update coming from Pavel Kolenko, who's the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. He says, quote, on March 12th, number of victims of Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 7 injured. This comes from also have a graphic here coming from his official Twitter, both released at 8 a.m. local time this morning, both in Ukrainian and in English, stating that so far, 4 people were injured in Bakhmut, with 2 in Krasnodarivka and 1 in Koshtanivka. 1,407 civilians thus far have been killed since February the 24th within the Donetsk region, with an additional 3,169 having been injured. Keep in mind, these numbers do not even comprehend, don't even come close to the true figures of what has happened. This doesn't take into account places such as Volnovakha, the occupied city of Donetsk, or the city of Mariupol, which is currently under occupation, where we know that just in that city alone, via Maxar satellite footage at multiple grave sites, that tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed, with many, many more likely having been significantly injured. And those are numbers that we won't have coming out of the occupied territory until it has been liberated. So while we do have these figures, do understand those figures are significantly worse. This is just what his office has been able to identify. Tonight's title story is about Bakhmut, and that's because Bakhmut holds. Bakhmut continues to hold, and it has since the early part of June of last year, when the Battle of Bakhmut started proper. And Ukrainian forces continue to be embattled in the very kinetic and partially encircled city of Bakhmut. Russian forces have taken the eastern side of the Bakhmutovka River, which separates the city of Bakhmut into 2 separate segments. with Ukrainian forces conducting a tactical withdrawal from that eastern sector into more of the heart of the city. Fresh Ukrainian troops have been rotated in, relieving the very weary veteran forces which have been sitting in the city of Bakhmut and have been fighting there for months on end. They're very heavily attrited, and they're very much a very weary bunch and really need to have been relieved. And so it's good we're seeing fresh units coming in, relieving them with additional reinforcements which continue to pour into the city for its defense. And the kinetic activity around this, the fighting that is taking place, is getting much more brutal day by day. The city is mostly destroyed, and the few residents that do still remain, several hundred of them, in fact, that still remain in the city of Bakhmut, reside mainly inside of their cellars, inside of their basements, because they're being used as makeshift bomb shelters. Continual artillery bombardment lands within the city and indiscriminately has just leveled everything within its wake. We can take a look at some of the combat footage coming out of here from Bakhmut, and this is what I mean by the shelling.
Все, отходь. Перебегай! Перебегай, блядь! Перебегай! Пусть! Пустой! Ой, хорошо. Трошки левее. А? Да, плюс.
As much as I enjoy listening to the music. So, as you can see, very brutal fighting. So what's actually happening now is we've gone in from fighting on the outskirts of the city into the actual fighting inside of the city itself, up here in the north in the industrial district, where it's been compared to the Battle of Stalingrad by Ukrainian defenders there in the city. And also we can see now also, of course, house-to-house fighting. And this type of fighting is called MOUT. It's MOUT, stands for Military Operations in Urbanized Terrain. And this is the most brutal type of fighting you can physically do in a combat zone. It is the most horrendous fighting you can do anywhere in the world. There is no comparison to urban combat. It's some of the most difficult fighting you will ever do, and it's the most attritive type of combat. To give you an example, whenever I was taught to plan, when we were being taught how to do orders and stuff, I was taught when planning for an operation in urban environments to plan for 80% casualties at a minimum. So 80% of forces that are going to go into combat will become some kind of casualty. AKA, if you go into a city to fight in a city, you will guarantee that that unit will not leave that city combat effective. You're guaranteeing that that unit will be completely incapacitated as a military unit. That is the mentality that you should have planning a military operation in urban terrain. 80% casualties at a minimum. And have a plan to take care of it. So this is going to be very brutal fighting because you have to clear out every house, every rubble, every outhouse, every garage, every shed, every tree, it's very, very difficult. It's horrendously difficult. If you want another good example of really a couple other really good examples of terrible house-to-house fighting, the Battle of Ramadi in Iraq, the Battle of Fallujah, the second battle especially of Fallujah, and the Battle of Way City in Vietnam. Once again, extremely brutal during the Tet Offensive. You could also look at places like Sangin and Marjah, Afghanistan, which also saw very significant casualties as a result of those operations. Why those Marines specifically, 1-6, are known as Marjah Marines. So, very, very, very brutal combat type. There's nothing that compares to it. There's nothing that comes close, and you could train on how to do it for multiple lifetimes and you would still not get everything right. It is extremely difficult. I've never ever been totally correct in anything I've ever done doing mount training. Gotten better, but never close, never good enough. Buckham40 asks a question. He says, I've said it before, how does Russia come away from Bakhmut? They have lost so much. Replacement equipment is substandard. Artillery is worn out. There are no lessons learned. Same mistakes are made. What's the end point here? Does Russia even think fighting here will end the war? Well, that's kind of the point. It's it from an outsider's perspective, right? And in my personal opinion, I take a look at the situation on Bakhmut, and I look at it historically speaking, as we've covered here on the channel before, of things like, when the Russians were in a better situation prior to what we see here, where they had Liman and they had, and they were pushing on Bakhmut and they could push on Slavyansk. Like, that made sense. That was a valid strategic method. That quickly was lost with the Kharkiv counteroffensive and the complete collapse of the Russian flank. But the troops and equipment were still situated in Bakhmut. And what it seems to me is that it turned into a fixing force around Bakhmut, meaning that you're now fixing Ukrainian troops, a small engagement, relatively small engagement, putting, Russian troops in Bakhmut to fix the Ukrainians in place. That way they don't maneuver because they're trying to defend this city. And that allows for your forces to kind of build up, maybe up here by Belhorivka, or, it's down here to the south near Horlivka, or maybe Avdiivka, where you need somewhere else to break the line, maybe down here in the Zaporizhia Oblast. But the Ukrainians put in a bunch of reinforcements there. And so now the Russians, who were trying to fix a bunch of Ukrainians in place, successfully doing so, now all of a sudden realize, well, if the Ukrainians break through here, it could completely collapse the Donetsk front. And so they put more troops in place. And as a result, the Ukrainians put more troops in there. And the Russians put more troops in there. And then the Ukrainians do, and the Russians. And so you just have them stacking more and more troops onto each other until all of a sudden what turned into a valid tactical choice, a valid tactical decision of trying to fix the enemy in place so that way you can outmaneuver them on the battlefield by focusing their attention and tunnel visioning them elsewhere, has now turned into both sides now having to slug it out in a war of attrition in a battle that really isn't significant other than the fact that both sides now have so many troops there that for someone to take a victory from Bakhmut means that that one side or the other is pretty much completely obliterated in one shape or another. Victory in Bakhmut means either the Russian forces have lost so many troops in this part of the sector that they will not be able to hold the line. They have obliterated their forces trying to take Bakhmut, or the Ukrainians have had their forces so completely destroyed it sets them back in counteroffensive plans because they're still defending Bakhmut, and those troops were attrited to the point that it will take significant time to recover. If not, the whole, several, tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops aren't just fully encircled here, which is not a small number of troops. Large-scale encirclement movements like this have proven that victories have proven significant in the outcomes of major conflicts in the past, especially when it comes to specific campaigns. Then you look at those numbers from, say, Operation Barbarossa in 1941, which is the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. You look at Operation Barbarossa in 1941, they were taking eye-watering numbers of Soviet troops in encirclement. However, the German forces outran their supply lines, and their commanders, prior to the invasion even starting, said that they only have enough supplies to last through pretty much the end of the year, really until October. So they really don't end up having enough supplies to support such a large invasion for a long time. And when those encirclement movements, while successful, take too long, you end up seeing that invasion stall out, lose its momentum, which is a very significant thing in warfare, is maintaining momentum in keeping the initiative. They lose the momentum, lose the initiative, and that's when the Soviets are really able to turn around and come back and start pushing the Germans back. So encirclement movements can be absolutely devastating for a military, as it was for the Soviets at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. We can see it being very devastating here too, if successful, because it all pretty much means that the Ukrainians lose, a pretty good chunk of their army in this sector of the front, which could open up more possibilities for later on follow-on offensives. So that's kind of my perspective on it. That's kind of what I pull from this whole situation. Book of 40 follows that up and says, so they've just lost their way and are now too stubborn. I wouldn't say it's that they're too stubborn. It's not being stubborn. It's you have to understand the situation now in Bakhmut is that there are too many forces here for both sides to just give up. It's not just a World War I mentality of stubbornness of, well, if we just a little bit more, it's this is now too important. One side has to win this, and whoever wins this is the one that's going to be able to walk away from possibly the war. Because losing Bakhmut, the amount of troops that would be lost in Bakhmut basically means whoever loses or wins this is either probably going to win in this sector of the front, or they're going to be too decimated that they will never be able to do really any offensive operations on any major scale ever again. Just because of how many troops are there now. So it's a winner-takes-all situation. So that's kind of the situation I see. Candy says it's territorial gains. And also following up on the equipment part of that, they say that's true. They were taking stored equipment from even the T-80s, let alone 70s, and not even evolved chest armor such as T-90s to capture Ukraine as Russian. Yeah, so the Russian equipment that they're bringing into the fight, some of it is still effective equipment. Don't get me wrong. The T-72 is a perfectly valid tank. They're not fighting the war that they were meant to fight. Things have changed since the T-72, T-80, and T-90s were put into service. Mainly the Javelin anti-tank system. Because at the time of these vehicles' designs, the greatest threat on the battlefield is another main battle tank. And when you look at how the T-72, T-80, T-90 are designed, it's perfect for a tank-on-tank engagement. But in Ukraine, they don't find themselves being used in tank-on-tank engagements. And very poorly trained crews, mostly because of a lack of survivability when these are hit, means that their crews are really poorly trained and do not make very effective in combat when they are finding themselves in that specific situation. So, in this point in the war, I hate to say it, but a tank is a tank. A T-62, T-72, T-80, T-90, it's something kind of to gawk at that they're bringing out T-62s. But when a Javelin will just as easily kill a Leopard 2 as it will a T-62, which is less expensive, the T-62 or the Leopard 2? Right? Which is less expensive, the Armada, the T-14 Armada, or the T-90? Or the T-90 or the T-62 or T-64 or T-72 or T-72B3 or BVM or whatever variant you want to pick. That's really the decision. So it doesn't really matter what they put into action, but it does make it more difficult for their supply lines because not all of them have the same main gun. Kennedy also says they also have more drones, Ukraine, so tanks are caught in bad situations because they're so bulky and it sticks out like a sore thumb. Ukraine actually has arguably been fielding either just as many, if not more. But we see heavy drone usage on both sides. So I don't know if it's that Ukraine has more drones. I would like to say that they are, but where are ATGMs at? Book of 40. Where are ATGMs at? Anti-tank guided missiles. So the Russians have their own versions of anti-tank guided missiles. The Javelin is unique. The Javelin system, you won't find anything else like it in the world, or at least you wouldn't until last year when the Chinese developed their own, which the main difference is has a less likelihood of a hit ratio, or it has a less hit ratio, a lower hit ratio, and it also is reloadable. Javelins aren't. They're fire and forget, and their tubes are just spent carbon fiber. So the main systems that Ukraine are going to be using are the man-portable systems. I say man-portable. Technically, a tow missile system is a man-portable system. We call it He-Man portable because it weighs a ridiculous amount. You actually pull up the book of knowledge here. For those that don't know, I do maintain, as you might be able to see there from at the bottom of my thing, that's all manuals and stuff I maintain from my time in the Marine Corps. And I still maintain my things like my books. Like this one, the Book of Knowledge, is the Anti-Tank Missile Student Handout, revised 2014 edition. And pull open to the Javelin here. Oh, sorry, the tow system. I don't care about defensive emplacements or armor ID. Please give me tow system. I want to learn how to blow things up with tow system. The by textbook definition of a saber system is an easily moved, heavy anti-tank precision fire weapon system designed to engage and defeat armored vehicles and other hard targets, such as field fortifications. The Saber contains embedded training circuitry and software, and training function is selected by the operator. Basically, what that means is it's easily moved. It's not very easily moved. But other systems that they also are using, the Russians are using, are very similar, more or less to the TOW anti-tank system. Less mobility for personnel, more firepower driven. Those TOW missiles can weigh upwards of 70 pounds. That's a TOW 2 Alpha right there, for those who are wondering. It's an empty casing, but that's a TOW 2 Alpha casing, and they're 70 pounds with the missile inside of them, and extremely heavy, very clumsy, very difficult. The Russians use similar systems. And those systems include things like the Konkurs, the Cornet, which is the bane of all Western anti-tank missiles, of the bane of all Eastern anti-tank missiles, I should say. Every single armor personnel, anyone who's ever worked with an armored vehicle in the U.S. Armed Forces knows of what a Cornet is, because it has very similar capabilities to that. So it's, you know, it's just their methodology to it is more of a defensive emplacement, which it looks more like, it's based off of, once again, their doctrine. When these things were designed, the Russians were intending to use their tanks and their armored spearheads, because they don't use light infantry. So they don't have light infantry in the Russian military. Everything is mechanized or motorized. Motorized rifle regiments, mechanized rifle regiments, rifle brigades. Their artillery is motorized. Hell, the VDV, they are mechanized. The BMD series of vehicles, their suspensions collapse so that way they can fit on board aircraft, supposedly to be paradrop, but more or less they paradrop the troops in there, they capture an airfield, bring in the aircraft. That was the whole point of Hostomel. But the counterattacks prevented them, and then the cratering of the runway prevented the IL-76s of landing and dropping off those BMDs. And so we don't really see them until later on, about a day and a half later, when they actually roll into those suburbs. So that's the point. The Russians were going to use mechanized spearheads during the 80s, when these doctrines were really at their height. Spearhead into Europe, take as much Europe as possible as the Soviets, and then, knowing that they were taking losses and that they couldn't gain anything past their initial gains, they go into a defensive warfare kind of mentality where they do a defense in depth. And part of that is heavy anti-tank guided missiles, such as the Konkurs and the Cornet, which, when you're fighting a defensive war with a defense in depth, as they were planning to, the need for it to be a mobile system like the Javelin or the In-Law really doesn't matter, because you can put TOW missiles in a bunker. It's in the book to do it. I know how to dig it with no other measurements than an M16A3 and a helmet. That is the measurements, believe it or not, that they put in these handbooks, because I don't have a yardstick or ruler or anything I care about when I'm in the field. But that's the point, that these systems, when they were designed, weren't meant to be used like the Javelin. They were meant to be done. Armored spearhead breaks through, take territory, stop when you no longer can take territory, immediately go into defensive emplacement, immediately can put up these anti-tank guided missiles into, along the main MSRs of your attacking forces, of the enemy attacking forces, have them in kill zones and everything else, be able to be successfully ambushing targets, and have them in hardened defensive emplacements to repel enemy attacks in a defensive death method. Makes sense for the Russians in the 80s. So you don't really see the need for the Russians to develop the Javelin. The U.S. ends up developing a Javelin. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. He also wants to know the destructive power of his ex-wife in my book of knowledge. And I think that's a little too classified for my level of clearance. I apologize. In the movie Aliens, the Marines use it to track and find aliens. Ukraine is using a version like it to track drones. Saw it on Twitter today. I didn't save it. Yeah, you can. Anything that puts off heat, essentially, you can track it with the Javelin. Anything that has infrared. Candy says, major props for serving, by the way. I had the will and heart in mind for it, but per military protocol, I couldn't due to scoliosis, which I understand. I'm not salty, but this stuff I love researching up on. Thanks so much for serving. Thank you for your taxes. That's really the only good response that I have to that. So I'm sorry it's sarcastic, but I apologize. I just don't have any other like good responses for this. For that, it's nice to know, but it's also kind of awkward at the same time. I didn't sign up for a thank you, I guess, is really what I had at. Getting back to the news here. Now that I spent like an hour talking. Getting back to the news, also coming from the Bakhmut front, now from the Russian side of things, Prigozhin has announced his intent to run for president of Ukraine 2024. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, has reported that they believe Putin has likely not decided yet on whether he will spare Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner's fate. Likely depends on Prigozhin's ability to convince the Kremlin of his loyalty. The rivalry between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense likely reached a boiling point. The British intelligence also reported that Wagner has likely lost access to recruiting in Russian jails due to Prigozhin's disputes, hence the opening of recruitment centers across Russia. Just take a look at one of the Wagner cemeteries in Kapan village in Bakhinskaya, Russia. This is a Wagner cemetery. Remember, this is just the fraction of ones that they bothered recovering and repatriating back, because most of them are just left in Ukraine. In light of this, he has abandoned his campaign of criticizing the Russian armed forces, posting, quote, there is no conflict between the fighters of the PMC Wagner and the fighters in the Russian Ministry of Defense. There are intrigues, but everything else leads only to victory, Yevgeny Prigozhin has reportedly said. And here is his political I'm coming out campaign.
Политический каминг-аут. Политический каминг-аут, громче говорю, чтобы все слышали. У меня только что появились политические амбиции, глядя на все вокруг. И я принял решение в 2024 году баллотироваться в президенты. В президенты Украины. В президенты Украины. И буду конкурировать на этом посту с Порошенко и Зеленским. Если выиграю выборы в президента Украины, то тогда будет все хорошо, ребят. Снаряды будут не нужны. Делаю политический...
I doubt he lives that long. Don't mind me, though. I do have a bias against the Wagner Group based off of personal experiences in my time in Syria, specifically that of February of 2018. So I really, personally, in my opinion, hope he doesn't live that long. But another reason that I hope he doesn't live that long, unfortunately, is because of what they're doing. And that's because if you come down here to Volodar, something that we see continually is the fact that in Volodar, we're seeing incendiary munitions usage. And we've reported incendiary munitions usage in Bakhmut alone, at least 9 separate occasions here across Ukraine, dozens and dozens of times. And here in Volodar, we see once again the 9S-22M incendiary grad rocket. It's a 122 millimeter Katyusha that is filled with incendiary octagonal pellets that then ignite upon air bursting over their target before raining down and burning everything in their path, burning at several thousands of degrees. They're being used here in the Volodar and Donetsk Oblast against Ukrainian forces, which have so far been able to resist against Ukrainian troops that continually try to assault from the perimeter of the city. The usage of incendiary weapons on civilians and civilian infrastructure, to include homes, is a war crime under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or the CCW, as well specifically Additional Protocol 3 of that, adopted in 1983, with the CCW being adopted in 1981, as well as the violation of Rule Number 85 of International Humanitarian Law when it is used against combatants specifically. The systemic use of these tactics under the 1993 Rome Statute consider this to be a crime against humanity. So when you see something happen over and over and over and over again, you know it's a war crime. You know it's a war crime. The usage of incendiary weapons on these cities is a war crime. Very clearly a war crime. There is no, you can't dispute that. It's a war crime. Whether you're talking about it being Additional Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which say that you cannot indiscriminately shell a city, which this would be indiscriminately shelling a city, also known, or whether it's Additional Protocol 3 of the CCW, whether it's Rule Number 85 of International Humanitarian Law, or IHL, doesn't matter. When it becomes systemic, when you see it happen repeatedly, under the 1993 Rome Statute, it means that that is no longer considered just a war crime, but a crime against humanity. When it becomes a tactic, when it becomes systematic, is a crime against humanity. Take a look. This is what it's like to be shelled with 9S-22M incendiary munitions.
Нормально. Что красиво. Та пока не попало. Якщо що, буду збивати. В курсі. Да. Ну я ж не думав, що це по 3 чувакам фосфор кинули. Блять, машину попало. Не нашу.
Нашу?
Ні. Ні, нормально, мимо.
Ты, блядь, руками не лезь.
Ні, ти що? Пронесло, вроді би всі цілі.
Под машиной одной хуярит.
Да, бачу.
Дядьки, а чья тачка, он горит под ней, под колесом?
Може убрати би лучше?
Notice how it set fire to whatever was left to catch fire there on the ground. We have a pretty incredible fate here. So this is a volunteer from New Zealand who was clearing out a Russian headquarters somewhere here in the Dunbas when he found his good Ukrainian squad mate in one of the prison cells who had been missing for over 2 months and was believed to have been dead.
Hands up! Give me your hands. Show me your hands. Show me your hands. Show me your hands.
Я зайду в подвал туда.
Shut up!
Право-лево, да. 3 комнаты. Подвал. Нижнего места.
Turn around. Turn around.
Иду.
Turn around.
О, Новозеланд.
Oh!
Новозеланд.
My brother!
Новозеланд.
I know him. He was in the raid house.
Guys. It's you.
Good guy. Come with me. Oh.
You can see what they were considering a prison. The Rasputitsa has once again arrived in Ukraine. The weather in Ukraine has been, for the most part, rather mild compared to the average year. And instead of the hardened permafrost expected around the end of February and early March, once again the Rasputitsa mud has begun to set in. This will once again bog down both sides, making it almost impossible to maneuver their forces on anything but paved roads, as even on foot, fields and dirt roads become very difficult to cross, while in vehicles it becomes completely impassable. Sorry, they had copyright music, but you can see this is the mud. Rasputitsa is Russian. It literally translates to Sea of Mud. And it's impossible to maneuver a vehicle in that. Ukrainian, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine says spring is here.
Не ругайся. На позиціях весна, на позиціях весна, повні чоботи багна, повні чоботи багна, по коліно у воді, по коліно у воді, захищаєм рідний дім. Отака історія. Весна на позиції. Не ругайся.
Springtime in Ukraine. Yup. That looks like Flanders in World War One. That looks miserable. And that is why you make a drainage sump in the bottom of your trench. Not just grenade sumps, but drainage sumps. Drainage sump. Jody? I don't think he mentions Jody in that one. For those that are wondering, Jody is an ongoing joke in the military. Coming down here to Mariupol, we have a couple of updates. Explosions at the Mariupol airport on March the 11th. The air defenses were active around the city today as well. You can see coming from view from the Mariupol airport over there. Some smoke billowing out. It's expected that the Mariupol airport is being used as a military base. It is likely the target of long-range missile strikes as well as drone strikes from Ukrainian forces. The city is far from being repaired, with only 22 new high-rise buildings having been made in the past year, but 1,950 plus so far being destroyed. This food truck says Mariupol is Russia, period. In case you're wondering. Re-education is in the works. Any books that dispute the Russian historical narrative of Ukraine has been thrown away from the local library at the Technical State University. Which is something we've touched on, but it's worth noting once again. William Young says there's no such thing as living in Mariupol, only surviving if lucky. Dare I say, I think surviving in Mariupol is the unlucky part. I think to have died in Mariupol was the luckiest thing to happen for anyone that had to endure that and continues to endure that, dare I say. Because I can't imagine, I cannot imagine having to go through what the Ukrainians of Mariupol have gone through. You are shelled by the, of course you're invaded. You're shelled by the Russians. You're encircled and besieged. If you try to escape through a previously agreed humanitarian corridors, you're bombed by the Russians. They are trying to kill you as you flee. And then, if you're in the city, you're bombed to the point of oblivion. 90% of the buildings in Mariupol are so destroyed that they will have to be demolished because even if they're still standing, and that's a big if, they're still standing, they are so unstable. There's no structural stability to them. You can never repair them. They're just structurally unsound. They have to be demolished. Whether it's Ukraine or Russia, they have to be demolished. It would just preferably be Ukraine doing it, because then they can document the war crimes that happened. You know, that's kind of the whole thing. Is documenting, hey, yeah, this is what happened. We can see the war crimes that happened. People were eating pets. Like, people were eating pets. People were killed trying to cook on some small fires that they had outside, and were shelled and killed in entire family groups. Summary executions. People just completely buried under the rubble. So many dead. Decomposing, and no running water. All the gas lines and the water lines and electricity obviously completely destroyed by the fighting and the constant shelling, to the point that people were drinking rainwater that was collecting in shell craters and washing their clothes in them and drinking it. And the problem with that is, when people decompose, you turn into kind of a puddle, everything that's not bones. So all this, what's left of people and everything, is seeping into this water, and they're having to drink it. There's no humanitarian aid really going into the city. The Red Cross is the only one, and hardly do they bring food. Most of the time they bring are blankets or vouchers for furniture. The Russian Red Cross. And you're forced to clear the rubble. After having been starved, continuing to starve. Cholera runs rampant in the city. There is no sewage. Disease. There is no medication. So people... And all the hospitals are destroyed too. So people were undergoing... You know, they have diabetes and things. You don't get insulin for diabetes. You know, you have to have an amputation. So people are having amputations... ad hoc amputations by somebody who knows if they're medically qualified or not. Hopefully a doctor that's working out of like the basement of what used to be his apartment building, at the very least. At least it be a doctor, please. I like to think so in this narrative, but they're going to these people. They need to have their leg amputated, or it will kill them. The diabetes will kill them. Because they can't get insulin because there's no medication, but they have to do it. There's no anesthetic for that because there is no medication. There's no antibiotics to prevent infection because there's no medication. There's no clean like gauze or anything to prevent infection. And so the mortality rate is significant. If the diabetes doesn't kill them, the infection will. There's nothing to fight the infection once you get it. And then being subjected to, you know, the Russian propaganda, of course, and Russian occupation, which we know what happens at a Russian occupation. They go through filtration point system and filtration, you know, camp system was developed in the 90s and early 2000s during the First and the Second Chechen Wars. Documented as war crime. The best comparison for a filtration point or camp system is a concentration camp. Thousands, over 10,000 Ukrainians from Mariupol, those that were left alive in Mariupol, were sent through filtration. No one knows where they've gone. No one knows. No one has any idea. They're gone. There's multiple mass grave sites around Mariupol. Tens of thousands. And that's just the identification from Maxar satellite footage. That's just the estimates from Maxar satellite footage. Probably significantly higher than that. That doesn't include the rapes and the torture and the beatings and everything else. I mean, it's just... You can't... There is no words that describe Mariupol. Stalingrad had more military casualties, yes. Over 1 million. It's the largest land battle ever fought. It's the deadliest land battle ever fought. But if there is anything to compare to Stalingrad, Mariupol's 100% it. Mariupol is the Stalingrad of the 21st century. Hands down. And dare I say, I think possibly worse. Because after the Soviets won in Stalingrad, they didn't put people in concentration camps. So yeah, I consider those that survive in Mariupol to be the unlucky ones, because going through all of that, I would rather just have been killed. And there is no closure, because the ones that they buried in the mass graves are the ones that they could have enough remains to bury. If there was just, you know, bone here, bone there, parts of people there, too incapable of identifying them really, too decomposed, they were taking them out with the rubble, with these buildings, and these buildings are going to be mashed up, the rubble. So people and buildings and rubble are all going to be mashed up and used as concrete to pave roads in Russia. Not even concrete to build high-rise buildings in Mariupol. No. Concrete to pave roads in Russia. Gives you a lot to think about. This is a little bit more graphic than what we normally show, but I think it's really important. I've hit on this before. This is the golden hour. For those that don't know, when someone becomes a casualty, you have about 1 hour to get them to a higher echelon of medical care, in order to, you know, ensure survival. Because if you don't get someone to a higher echelon of medical care within the first hour, and that's as simple as getting them to a field hospital, preferably higher up, but a field hospital. If you don't get someone to a field hospital or something, a higher echelon of care within the first hour, they end up, it's a very quick, you know, you drop in chances of survival for an injury. And the Azov Battalion here, they are showing the realities of war. And this is soldier, he's hit by a piece of shrapnel. It punctures into his chest cavity. Seems to cause either a collapse of the lung, but from what I see in the video, it's more than likely a tension hemothorax or tension pneumothorax, which is there's an empty space inside of your chest cavity below your ribs, but before you get to the lungs, this is empty space. It's how your lungs have enough area to expand and contract as you breathe in and out, in and out. And what happens is, if you get hit with shrapnel, you can get these things called a sucking chest wound, which is where air is rushing into that cavity and it fills it, or blood. Blood is another thing that can fill it. If it punctures an organ and you start bleeding, internal bleeding can put pressure on that lung, and it makes it very difficult to breathe. It makes it very difficult to breathe, and that puts pressure on your lung, but also on your heart and your other internal organs, and that can actually cause cardiac arrest and other things if not treated. The way you treat this is with what's called a needle decompression. It's an 18 gauge needle, if I remember correctly. It's an 18 gauge needle. Comes in most basic kits, most basic, at least med kits for actual medics or corpsmen or CLS Marines or whatever. And you actually put this and you puncture it at a 90-degree angle. You puncture it into the chest, and it helps relieve the air or the blood and allows it to escape to relieve pressure on that. It's called needle D or needle decompression. And it's for tension hemothorax, tension pneumothorax, and tension pneumothorax, which is blood and air. But take a look. It's a little bit more graphic, but I think it's important because it shows you that, like, the triage reality of warfare. Of this is how people are handling battlefield casualties. You see it in movies, but this is the reality. This is what it's like. Someone is hit. They need immediate aid. This is what it's like to render aid to them.
Плавно дихай. Ти чуєш мій голос, Шахта?
Не могу дышать. Не могу дышать.
Плавно дихай.
Не могу. Дышать не могу.
Ласун. Ти вже зробив
Один фрагмент
половину
нашої
справи.
роботи.
Тепер нас забирають.
Плавно. Подивися. Це наш найкрутіший медик.
О, бачиш, друг?
О, задихав.
Красава. Ти головне дихай. Друже, повільно.
Дышать не могу.
Уже можеш. Тобі відкрили легені, вон, бачиш? Ти можеш дихати.
Я сегодня видел. Ты просто супергерой. Я все правильно сделал. Я закрыл 2 дырки. Воздух не выходит. Поставил иглу.
Дай водички, я теж поп'ю. Поранених?
Так, 300.
Де? Де тут?
150 метрів десь.
Туди?
Так, друзі. Не те, що щодня, а майже щогодини. Отакі у нас круті воїни. Йому пробило легені. Він майже задихнувся. Офігенні медики. Геройські воїни. Красава, друже. Ти красава. І всі, хто винесли, евакуювали по таким полям. А, де я зараз покажу. От, по таким пагорбам.
Скажи, як твій позивний в цьому прекрасному цьому інстаграмі, щоб хлоп потім відосик взяв.
Немає можливості все це показати, але зараз один з наших героїв. Чекаємо на евакуацію і все буде добре, обов'язково переможемо.
So he does end up surviving, but you see the important things here, right? You see, so he asked them, you know, so the first thing he does, right, is he's going through and he's using raptor shears and he's cutting off those clothes because he doesn't need them anymore. You need to see what's going on. And there's this thing, it's called PM EST that you have to go through. I do not want to go through it right now. But it's the methodology of going through it and treating a casualty. But he's talking to him. So the biggest thing you do is you talk to them. It tells you a lot of things when you're talking with a casualty because a lot of things could have happened, and whether that is, you know, you can know that there's possibly brain trauma. He's, you know, conscious, unconscious. He's losing his consciousness. He's going in and out of consciousness. It could be that he's going into shock. There's a lot of things. But the first thing he says is deep breath, you know, hey, because he's leaning down, he's trying to cut this, but he's also listening. Hey, is he breathing? Can you hear my voice, Shakta? And the guy starts talking to him, and that immediately tells him he has an open airway, so he doesn't have any teeth or anything that's fallen into the back and has closed his airway. So I don't have to do a needle D, I don't have to do a King LT, and as a medic, more, you know, sometimes if it's too deep of a blockage and I can't clear out that blockage to get an airway open, you know, a crike or so I don't have to crike him. I don't have to, you know, cut open his neck and put an airway in there. And so he's cutting him off. So, you know, the guy starts, you know, talking to him, you know, about his injuries. Okay, he's conscious, he's clear, he understands what's happened, he knows where he's at, he knows who he is. Shock isn't setting in yet. So the shock isn't setting in, so he's good and clear in consciousness. He's awake, which means I don't have to put an MPA in him. He's breathing, so he has an open airway. So that's 3 things right there. And now he can help me, he can guide me. Hey, this is where I got hit or whatever. This, you know, it hurts. You know, I'm having issues breathing. So if his situation deteriorates, I can say, okay, you know, I need to do this because I can see he's going in and out of consciousness. He's lost too much blood. I might have to do a blood transfusion. Maybe I might have to put some fluids into him. You know, I might be having to put an airway into him because he goes, I can't breathe. Needle D. Okay, he's having trouble breathing. He has a puncture wound in his chest. It's probably gurgling and sucking a little bit, so it's probably a sucking chest wound. I need to put an occlusive dressing onto him to stop the sucking chest wound, and I probably need to do a needle D because he either has blood or he has air that's going in there. You know, deep breath. He's having issues breathing. You can let him sit up if he's still having issues. And you can see this guy's pulling out the tarp. You know, he's pulling out that rescue blanket because you want to keep him warm. You do not want him going into shock. Shock will kill you. Shock is your body's natural response of trying to keep you alive. But naturally, shock is actually so violent, it will kill you. As easily as the injury will, shock is one of the most easily preventable, but also one of the deadliest things that so many people don't think about. The body going into shock is something that people don't think about when treating casualties. You're worried about the wound. Shock will kill them just as easily, if not more so, as the actual wound itself will. And so he's putting that mercy blanket on him, keep him warm, keep him going into shock. He's still talking to him, and you hear him yell. Because putting a needle in someone's chest isn't exactly enjoyable. Nothing about being wounded is enjoyable, to include the treatments that you're getting in the battlefield. If you get hit in the leg, I'm immediately dropping. If you get hit in your leg and I got to put a tourniquet on you, I'm dropping my knee as high up into your crotch area as I can. And I'm going to be putting my knee to put pressure on your artery, your femoral artery, or if it's on your arm, your brachial artery, and you're going to be screaming in pain. But I'm cutting off the blood flow so you don't bleed out and die while I put a tourniquet on you to take over that job. Putting a needle D in your chest, none of that is comfortable. I'm putting a hole in your chest cavity, purposefully, with a giant needle, without any kind of painkillers, because the painkillers are going to thin the blood, which is going to make you bleed out faster. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to put a needle D in you, and you're not going to have painkillers, and it's going to be excruciatingly painful. But it's going to keep you alive. You can see he's still talking to him, and he's got that dressing on there, but he's going to be swapping out. That's an occlusive dressing. From the looks of it, you can see kind of the outline where he's trying to stamp it down. That's to keep the air from sucking in. There's vents in an occlusive dressing that keeps the air from going in, but he's still able to breathe. It's specially made for those types of wounds. And he's listening, and when he leads down, he does the needle D, he leans down, and you can see the needle D in his chest. That's what the little orange thing right here is. That's the needle D. That's the end of the needle. And you can see the rest of it in his hand as he's holding it. And he leans down, and what he's listening for is to hear the hiss. Because he's listening to see if it's hissing, the air is leaving that chest cavity. So it's relieving that pressure in his chest cavity. And you can hear it. It will actually hiss as it comes out. Because it's a bunch of air going through a very small tube. If it's blood, you'll see, if it's a tension hemothorax, you'll see that there's blood that starts to pool out of there. Instead, it's a visual sign instead of an audio one. But you're checking it. And he's also still wanting to make sure he's still breathing and all this stuff. And he wants to see if his breathing is decreased or improved, to see if he's getting better or worse. Because if it's getting worse, then the needle D isn't helping, and that's not the issue. Which means, going back to, he probably has a collapsed lung, which is what the original thought was. So he's like, hey, you start to breathe. Good job, bro. So he's telling him he's doing a good job, trying to keep him in good spirits, keep him mentally there, trying to give him water because he's probably dehydrated, because losing blood dehydrates you. He's just sitting there talking with him, because you never, ever leave your patient. You never leave a patient unattended. Because it does not take very long, because the guy comes over and says, hey, we got another injured about 150 meters from here. That medic that's with him right now, it's giving him water and stuff, he's not going. He's got a patient. He has a patient to take care of. And it doesn't take very long, especially with a severe injury like this, because this is very severe. It's very life-threatening to have this. It does not take very long before something goes wrong. And depending on the medical training these other guys have, that could be significant. But if they have someone else that they can bring him over, that other casualty, bring him 150 meters over to here, it would probably be best. That way you can watch them both simultaneously, which appears what he seems to do, because they're still hanging around and has this medic, sit there trying to apply the bandages, but they're putting other occlusive bandages on it. So you can see, so you don't usually get to see this, but this is the reality of treating casualties. This is so many things to go through, and there's so many things that doesn't get covered on that. Tiger clawing, putting in, and a lot of more things that for my instance I was trained to do. At the same time I'm writing down, while I'm doing this thing, I am thinking of the Z-mist and 9 lines I got to do to call in a bird. I got to think about the LZ I got to put them out. I got to, if I'm the one that's declaring the LZ, I need to think about how big of the bird it is that's going to be coming in. If it's a Blackhawk, I have to have, 100 meters by 100 meter LZ cleared and have to have it marked. And there's a lot of other things that go into it. But when just treating the casualty, there's a lot of things to worry about, a lot of small things, because is there an exit wound on the other side? Because just because he has an occlusive dressing here doesn't mean that there's not an exit wound for a piece of shrapnel on the other side that's letting air in through his back. And you might not be able to see it. So you're going to have to go over and you got to put your fingers like this, and you have to tiger paw until one of your fingers falls through the hole, because it might not be bleeding. It might not be apparent. And he's covered in blood anyway, so you might not be able to tell if that's where it's coming from. There's so many small things. It's very interesting. It's very in-depth. And if you ever have the opportunity to go into a course to learn how to do these things, to do triage for trauma, I highly encourage it. Because if you get into a car accident, or if you see someone else get into a severe car accident or something like that, or someone that you know or love gets injured seriously, those moments, those immediate reactions of being able to deal with triaging somebody, those very crucial opening moments, that first golden hour and those first few minutes is life and death. You can't make a mistake, but knowing what to do is definitely going to help you, and keeping prepared. So I found it very interesting. It was very hammered home to me, and I think it's a very valuable life skill that pertains not just to military or police or first responder, but I think it's something very important for everyone to know, how to treat people that have been, seriously injured. Jump over here into Kherson, where 3 people have died following the shelling of the city of Kherson once again. We can see here some of the imagery coming out from the shelling. In case you're wondering what these people were doing, they were going to the grocery. Going from back and alive. A very gross thing, by the way, but a very important thing to know whenever treating casualties. Oftentimes with mines and IEDs and things like this, you'll have pretty serious brain issues. If someone, if there's blood coming out of their ears, you want to test that. Just kind of an interesting fact. If you want to test that, you can do it one of 2 ways. Take like a piece of gauze and put it in there, and pick up some of the blood and then set it to the side while you continue triaging. If there is if there's spinal fluid, in it, cerebral spinal fluid in it, it'll form a halo around the blood. It separates in that. But if you don't have any gauze to spare, or you're trying to do it quick, if you taste it, which I don't highly recommend doing this, but if you taste it, because you have to, and it has spinal fluid in it, leaking out of the ears, it will taste sweet. It's supposed to taste sweet. At least 2 people were killed and 3 were injured in Russian shelling. Quote, Russian occupiers shelled the city of the Korsubsk, Kuts, Sorupska community in the Mykolaiv region on March the 13th. 2 people were killed, 3 citizens were injured, including a 7-year-old child. And that's, end quote, coming from Vitaly Kim, the head of the Mykolaiv Regional Military Administration. Erevis asks, what does halo mean? Halo, it will form a yellowish ring. So you'll have like the blood in the center, and then it'll form like a yellowish ring around it, where you can see that there's a difference between the spinal fluid and the blood. So you're welcome. If you're currently eating dinner, I apologize. Just important things, important, very much life-saving things. But other than that, I hope that you guys, but that covers everything in Ukraine. I hope that you guys learned something from most of that. I'm sorry I spent so long covering it. But that allows us to now get into the international news. And of course, we start off with other places throughout the world, and of course here in Russia. And we start off in Belgorod, where a Belgorod governor has claimed that missiles were shot down over the city. It has been a loud few nights in Belgorod, with 4 loud explosions last, and the work of air defense. It is now being reported that explosions can be heard in the city tonight too. Regional officials claim that at least 4 missiles were intercepted over the city, causing a fire. So that is the air defense systems. Coming from Voronezh, we just see some kids on their way to school. So this is what life is like as a child in Russia, that they're supposedly helping the Ukrainians try to achieve this way of life, supposedly.
Мир нам завидует. Вы говорите весь мир. А они нам завидуют. Я вам точно говорю. Я знаю, что я говорю.
Я думаю, что Путин послан Богом нам, и слава Богу, что он есть.
Весь мир.
Definitely not great living conditions for a modern first world nation. Paul without tangents would be like a triangle without angles. Yeah, that's true. And William Young just says, just say no to Rip It Mafia. No. Gotta love Rip It. These are a lifesaver. This is the single best cheap energy drink on the market. If you have a chance to have a Rip It, there's only one way to drink a Rip It, and you have to rip it. It's the only way. So, best energy drink in the world, hands down. My personal favorite. But I do prefer the 8-ounce cans. I love the 8-ounce cans so much better than these ones. These are the 16s, which are so much harder. I usually do about half at a turn. But the 8-ounce cans are just something just magical about them. Russia is now making the grain deal negotiations very difficult. Citing sanctions by Western countries, which have limited Russia's export market for homegrown agricultural goods, Russia has been in limited talks regarding the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative led by the UN. One proposal offered by the delegation was the extension to be for only an additional 60 days, citing the original extension being 120. And so we can see here, coming from the Russian mission to Geneva, regarding those negotiations. Coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying there were no talks conducted on the grain deal extension with Russian representatives. So far, only the Ukrainian part has been implemented. Russian agricultural exports continue to be blocked by Western unilateral sanctions. Once again, also talking about the Istanbul agreements proposed by Antonio Guterres, they do not object to another extension of the Black Sea Initiative, but only for 60 days. Once again, using food as a weapon. Here's an interesting set of words. Modernized T-62s. Yes, you heard that correctly. The situation must be quite dire at this point for the Russians, as Russia has begun taking out T-62s from storage to repair, paint, and modernize them for the war in Ukraine. They will have the newest equipment, such as thermal scopes and dynamic armor. Let's take a look here. Obviously, some thermal imagery scopes. It should be noted that these systems, the T-62 is so old, it doesn't even have an autoloader on it. Also, I don't know if you can't tell this, but those are supposed to be ERA, which is explosive reactive armor. Those are in ERA. And at that, they're also not properly put on there. There's actually mounts that you have to put on. But yeah, this is a tank factory in Russia that is producing T-62s modernized. I don't know how you modernize a T-62. T-62 is one of the very few T-Series variants that does not have an autoloader as well. So it is all done manually. It is good old-fashioned guy with a good arm. But the T-62s were essentially outdated at their debut, which is why the T-64 was immediately redesigned and put into production using a cheaper version of road wheels, the stamped road wheels. This is why the T-64 is the only series to have stamped road wheels. Unfortunately, that shortens the life of those road wheels quite drastically. So they switched back to milled road wheels, which are more intensive in their manufacturing process, but are definitely going to be much more long-lasting. The Russian First Guards Army, the most elite unit in the Russian army, was supposed to get the new T-14s, but instead are getting these T-62s. Yeah. By the way, for those that don't know what I was talking about, so all these little blocks on here, there's a thing called reactive armor you can put onto these tanks. The point of the reactive armor is to prevent tandem charge warheads from detonating and destroying the tank. They don't really work against modern tandem charge warheads, but they're really good against single charge warheads like the RPG rounds. Or the tandem RPG round, which that exists, but they're not nearly as good. This is not ERA. Most people will say this is ERA, which stands for Explosive Reactive Armor. This is not ERA. This is NERA, or Non-Explosive Reactive Armor. ERA is actually, it's a shape charge, so it actually has some curvature to it. When it looks like blocks from afar, but it actually has some curvature to it because it's an explosive that blows up and away from the tank without damaging the tank, but destroying the explosive. These ones are in ERA, which means that more than likely these are just blocks filled with rubber between two steel plates. And the round goes, the first charge hits the round, or the first charge punctures through that first steel plate, but all of that molten metal that was meant to, punch through the armor of the tank basically gets caught up in all this rubber and melts all the rubber and everything, but it's contained, it's absorbed inside of that rubber box. It's a valid type of reactive armor. It's, like I said, mostly effective against single charge warheads like the RPGs and the AT4s as well, laws, things like this. But tandem charge warheads, the in-laws, the TOW, the javelin and stuff like that, these will punch right through these. It's a waste of money to put these on if you know you're going to be facing tandem charge warheads. It's just not a... If what you're expecting this thing to fight is tandem charge warheads, it's a waste of time. It's, at this point, it's more of a comfort factor to make the crew feel safer, so that way they are actually willing to engage instead of just hiding around. Would not bet my life on that theory. Javelins? Question mark. Yeah, like I said, it's not meant for the javelin. It's meant for RPGs and AT4s and LAWs. It's not made for TOWs or javelins. It's just not going to happen. Coming over to Moldova, Russia is waging a hybrid war against Moldova. This was stated by the Minister of Defense of Moldova, Anatolia Nosati, after a series of organized anti-Romanian language protests broke out across the country. Multiple men have been detained who are suspected of trying to destabilize the protests. And there is a further story on that from DW. The U.S. believes that individuals connected to the Russian intelligence are planning to organize protests in Moldova to overthrow the government and install a pro-Russian government, according to a CNN report citing unnamed White House officials. Notice there seems to be a lot of people that are definitely interested in, Russia. Considering they're just chanting Russia. So obviously some instability there. A man was detained at the airport in Chisinau immediately after arrival on March 12th. During a search, police found his military ID and documents that revealed him to be a member of the Wagner private military corporation. Obviously, he had some photos taken of his stuff. as we continue on here. Serbia, after Hungary and India at this point, Serbia is now also reconsidering its stance towards Russia. The Minister of Economy of Serbia, Rada Bashta, spoke out in favor of sanctions against Russia. Quote, Serbia is already paying a heavy price for refusing to impose sanctions against Russia. I support the introduction of sanctions. We jump down here and into the Middle East, where coming out of Tel Aviv, Israelites continue to protest against government measures. 200,000 protesters against Netanyahu's policies intending to weaken the Supreme Court and reforms of other institutions. Other protesters have gathered in other cities, including 50,000 in Haifa and 10,000 in Beersheba and 10,000 in Jerusalem and 5,000 in Ashdod. So these these anti-government reform protests do continue here in Israel. It's not the only piece of the pie that Israel has its hand in, though, as we jump up here and into Syria, where the Israeli Air Force ended up striking targets inside of Syria. The Israeli Air Force did end up striking both Syrian military targets and the suspected IRGC facilities within Syria as part of their ongoing strikes against Iranian targets within the region. The IRGC do operate inside of Syria and other places throughout the Middle East as they continue to try and be used by the government in order to destabilize the region and train foreign fighters for those destabilization efforts. Photos coming out from the region. Some pretty massive strikes. We jump over here into the Merv, or Middle Euphrates River Valley, a place that I am especially very well aware of. And especially this site specifically. This is Green Village here, and this is where the rocket attacks on a U.S. outpost occurred. U.S. troops in the MSS, or Mission Support Site Green Village, quote-unquote, near the Conoco gas fields were once again targeted by rockets. 2 rockets landed outside the wire, but so far there are no indications what group is responsible for the attacks. According to the U.S. Central Command, there were no casualties or damage to the site. And this is coming from the United States Central Command. And so this area, there's a lot of U.S. outposts. As you can see, you can see where these oil fields were. What these black spots in the desert are, these are actually burned oil rigs. So this is the Umar oil fields as well as the Conoco gas fields that are located here, specifically up by Deir Azur, which is up here to the north, and all the way down here as you get close to the Iraqi border. And these oil fields were in the caliphate for the Islamic State. This is where the Islamic State was using these oil rigs that they had captured in order to pump oil and sell it on the black market to fund the caliphate. This is one of the reasons why the Islamic State was so successful as a caliphate and was able to take territory, because they were able to build some kind of economy even via the black market with high levels of production, something meaningful. Where most other groups were funded by, well, under-the-table means from sometimes governments, sometimes private individuals, sometimes just through good connections and money laundering. But this was a more official way of doing business. The U.S. came in. We bombed this area during the air campaigns. When I went to Syria, I first stayed in Kuwait. And from the base in Kuwait, I slept at the end of the airstrip in a place called Tent City in Ahmed al-Jaber Air Base. And they would take off or land aircraft every 30 minutes. They would take off fully loaded. They would come back completely empty. A massive air campaign. And this went on for months. And they are 8-hour continuous missions, round trips. And they bombed the hell out of this place, as you can tell. So that's what all these black dots in the middle of the desert are. That's actually destroyed oil wells from when we bombed them. And then we put up mission support sites in this region because to the south of the Euphrates River, so this area to the northeast is considered to be coalition SDF controlled territory in the Al-Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor provinces. Whereas to the south of this, the MERV is the deconfliction line. So the Russians and pro-Assad regime is to the, is on the other side of the Euphrates River, or the MERV. So when you hear about the Wagner group crossing that area, they end up pushing across this. They end up pushing across the deconfliction line and end up attacking the Conoco gas fields in Green Village and stuff for those Wagner mercenaries in 2018. That was one of the big indicators: is someone was attacking us and had crossed the MERV, which was one of the reasons why it was a big deal, and why we knew it had to be either Assad or the Russians, and immediately called the hotline. Buckham 440 says, so we spend millions in exposed troops protecting Conoco assets. That is not what we're doing. It is strategic, and it prevents the Islamic State from further building these oil rigs, but the situation in Syria is, at least as of the time I was there, was still not nearly stable enough for any kind of reconstruction efforts to take place here. So while a lot of people talk about, are we stealing oil from Syria and this, that's the whole point of us still being in Syria, that's not true at all. I never once was briefed to ever protect any construction teams, any oil drill teams, any workers, any convoys for oil. Never saw an oil truck unless it was burned out on the side of the highway. Never ever saw anything like that. And my unit was the ones that established a lot of the sites that you hear about now, to include Green Village, and to include Conoco. So, there wasn't a base there when I went there. There was a flat, empty, a bunch of desert, a bunch of burned out hulks of rusting metal in the middle of the desert. And we said, this is right next to Deir ez-Zor, which at the time was still controlled by the Caliphate. And we said, okay, Deir ez-Zor is up there. These are very valuable assets that the Islamic State would really like to have in order to fund their war effort. This is also some really specific locations that the Assad regime would like to have, because we support the SDF, not the Assad regime, because they gas people. But the SDF would like them, because they are trying to, make a democratic nation out of Syria. Syrian Democratic Forces. And so we put a site there, as well as the SDF, who coexist amongst us, here in Conoco, or Conoco's over here, but here in Green Village and in Conoco, and that puts us within artillery battery range of Deir ez-Zor, but it also allows us to establish the deconfliction line with the Russians and Assad. It allows us to protect the assets for the SDF, which is something that helps the SDF stay on our side instead of turning against us, because there have been issues with the SDF in the past. And it also allows us to maintain a pretty good supply route, because you got to think KLZ was up here in the north, and near, up by Al-Hasaka, and up here further in the north, C-130 accessible airfield. Al-Shaddadi, Fire Base Shaddadi, which, if I zoom in here, you can actually see it. That is Fire Base Shaddadi, or FBS. Which also has an air wing there for them. Sawar, Spokane, Conoco, Green Village, all of these locations have strategic points because they're major points of Islamic State activity, but they serve multiple purposes at the same time. You don't try and hold everything. You want to have specific key points. And that is what we were doing, and that's what we continue to do. So I hope that kind of explains that for you, Buckham. We're not there for oil, because you ain't getting anything out of Conoco. You're not getting anything out of the Umar oil fields, but we're there. We are there. That's true, but we're not getting anything out of it. There's no oil producing capability of the Umar oil fields. There's no significant economic gain for the U.S. for having troops in these regions. It is 100% about strategic sites against the Islamic State, which is the area they have the most effect over right now, and they have the biggest presence for, and because the Russians are here, and the Assad regime is here. So I hope that explains Syria for some of those. It is a much more complicated situation than that, but that is the simplest to break it down for that story and for those questions. Come over here and into Tehran, the capital of Iran, where Lukashenko, the self-proclaimed dictator of Belarus, visited Iran. So Iran and Belarus have signed a bilateral cooperation agreement valid until 2026. It includes cooperation in the political, economic, consular, scientific and technical spheres in the field of education, culture, mass media, tourism, and this is all being reported by the state agency Belta. Sanctions give us opportunities. Let's not waste them this time. He, quote, end quote. The self-proclaimed genius Lukashenko said during his visit to Iran. The U.S. State Department stated that it is closely watching the growing relationship between Belarus, Iran, and Russia.
Уважаемых президентов Республики Беларусь, господина Александра Лукашенко, а также господина Раиси, иранского президента, к подписанию дорожной карты сотрудничества между Ираном и Республикой Беларусь. Приглашаем уважаемых президентов
Iranians are protesting against serial poisoning of schoolgirls. The Iranian people held gatherings of foreign human chains in more than 70 cities of the world on Saturday, and condemned the serial poisoning of schoolgirls back in the country of Iran.
Support Iran uprising! Now, now, now! Down with dictator! Down with Khamenei! One solution, revolution! One solution, revolution! Change, change, change! Regime change in Iran! Change, change, change! Regime change in Iran! Change, change!
For anyone who's wondering, that is my co-host Inky. Looking forward to asked an interesting question. So, what is the long-range plan dealing with Iran? Containment and interdiction of Iranian assets, I guess. The Iranian women revolt. The Iranian woman revolt is a long time coming. That's a really good question, and I think that's a question that doesn't really have an answer. Like many things with the Middle East, the situation isn't very straightforward. Parts of the problem with the wars on terror and the situation with Afghanistan, a lot of the frustrating things that not only perpetuated the conflicts, but also but also, you know, still causes instability within the region, and that we don't have a game plan for a lot of this stuff is because the situation is much more it's a much more complex than just we beat the Taliban, so let's get out of there. Because you see what happens with the Taliban. Taliban weren't beaten in Afghanistan. The Taliban weren't beaten. They were in hiding. They weren't beaten. Yes, we kicked out Al Qaeda. We killed their leadership. We killed Osama bin Laden, and all of this, but overall, we didn't necessarily beat the Taliban, which is what we had been fighting for the additional 10 years it took us after we killed bin Laden. And it's hard to fight an insurgency. It's hard to fight these things. Syria, there's 40 plus groups fighting each other in Syria. The YPK and the YPG and the YPJ are not the same thing. Well, the YPG, YPJ are. They're all under the YPK, but the PKK and the YPK are not the same thing. They have alignments in a lot of ways. Primarily, they're Kurdish. That's one of them. The most oppressed people in the Middle East are the Kurds. But they're not the same thing. They're two separate groups. Same thing with, you know, there's the difference between pro-Assad regime or pro-Assad versus Assad versus pro-Russian versus Russian mercenary versus American versus coalition versus the SDF, which is different from the Kurds, which is different from the PKK, which is different from the Turks, you know, the Turkish, which is different from the pro-Turkish, which is different from the Islamic State, which is different from Al Qaeda, which is different from the IRGC, which is different from the Iranians, which is different from the Quds Force. There is so many groups that are fighting in just Syria. You have Iran and you have Saudi Arabia, fundamental different parts of Islam. They're fundamentally different denominations of Islam. One is Shia, one is Sunni. And they are constant for thousands of years, just over Islam, let alone political differences. They're fighting over each other. They aren't directly connected, but Iran is using the power vacuum created and the instability created by the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the casting out of the Saddam regime. They're using that to try and use Maqtada al-Sadr. First, they used that to fight Americans, which they believe are Zionists and all this other stuff. And using them they went and they trained things like the Quds Force and the RGC across the border, and they trained people like, you know, Sadr's army. The Mahdi army is what that's actually called. The Mahdi army, the peace brigades, the insurgencies, for the most part, that were trained in Iraq and were fighting the United States. The vast majority received training by Iran. A lot of them went to Iran, crossed the border, and trained in IRGC camps on the border for going back into Iraq and fighting Americans. The Iraqis didn't just magically come up with IEDs. More importantly, while IEDs are simpler, IEPs, or improvised explosive projectiles, which can punch through the armor plating of MRAPs, like what you see not just in the 2000s during the occupation of Iraq, but especially after U.S. forces were invited back to Iraq to deal with the Islamic State, and you see IEPs, which actually kill American troops in Iraq in the mid-2000s, or in the mid-20-teens, and late 20-teens. Improvised explosive projectiles are a shaped charge. They're not a simple explosive. It's a shaped charge, meaning it is built, it is shaped, its purpose is to punch through armor. That's not something some guy just sits there and comes up with in his garage making IEDs. And that's something that it was trained by Iranian forces. That's why Kataib Hezbollah is operating in Iraq. They are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, but they're Iranian trained. They're Iranian backed. Where do you think they get the munitions? Who do you think keeps firing rockets at the Baghdad Embassy complex? Who do you think did it for the month and a half I was shelled while I was there? Who do you think also attacked the U.S. Embassy on New Year's of 2020? All of those flags were Kataib Hezbollah. In fact, if I can pull them up here, I'll even pull one up for you guys. Let's see. Are you not going to pull up? Please give me Iraq. Sorry guys, I gotta look through my stuff to find this. Is all this just from 2003 or 2016? Maybe. Fortunately, what a lot of I have is on my computer is from my first deployment because I saved that. Well, I might not have it easily accessible, which is unfortunate. Unless, sorry guys, give me a second. I'm not trying to like lose you here, but I have photos to like send and show. Actually, they might be. Where's my OneDrive? Yeah, I might just have to give up on this. Okay, anyway, or I could just probably look it up. That'd probably be easier. U.S. Embassy attack Baghdad. And we'll go images. Fun time, everybody. Definitely a fun time. Is that just going to be... So, pulling this lovely stuff up. I apologize for, like, going slightly off topic here, but I say slightly off topic. So, trying to pull up images. Hey, I know who that is. Give me a bunch of flags. Open image in a new tab. So I don't know if you noticed this. So the lovely thing about this, you see this flag right here? You see that AK that's currently sitting above that, you know, symbol, the symbol of the Prophet specifically. That right there, that is Hezbollah. That is the telltale sign of Hezbollah. So if I pull up Kataib Hezbollah, and I pull up their image, that is the sign of Kataib Hezbollah. That is an Iranian-backed, like that's an Iranian-backed organization. Like, that is, hands down, everyone knows Iran backs Kataib Hezbollah. The Iraqis admit it, and they're part of their popular mobilization force, or PMF. See that? Weird. It's the same symbol. It's Kataib Hezbollah militants. That's their flag. See this? That's the Peace Brigades. Do you know who operates the Peace Brigades? Muqtada al-Sadr, which is why I'm hoping that there's a nice picture of this. Yeah, you can see all of the Kataib Hezbollah flags up there, by the way. Where is the giant poster of Muqtada al-Sadr that they had hanging up across from us? Give me... I love how they took a lot of photos of the embassy, but not a lot of photos of what was happening around us. I remember when that happened. That was actually really dope. The helicopters above us just popping flares off at like 100 feet. Pretty wild. Do they not have it? I don't think they're gonna have a picture of it. It's unfortunate. I do, and I don't have it on my thing. Anyway, so going back to the actual point of this whole thing. So the issue is that Iran has a lot of fingers in the pie, but they never do anything directly. And just like they won't attack Saudi Arabia correctly, or directly, I should say, they ship weapons from the Gulf of Oman across into the Arabian Sea, into the Gulf of Aden, and they bring them into Yemen, and then they take them to the Houthi rebels who overthrow the Yemeni government, and they fight the Saudi coalition that went in to restabilize Yemen. So Iran funnels weapons to the rebels, who they are training as well, to fight the Saudis. So it's a proxy war. It's a proxy war for Iran. They're not directly involved, but they're doing it for their political aims. They back Muqtada al-Sadr, who, if you remember, while we've been doing this channel, has tried several times to overthrow the Iraqi government. I can't imagine why that is. It's why the United States still has a pretty good presence in Iraq. Because we assist with dealing with that. And we assist with the fact that we're fighting the Islamic State for them. Because the Iraqi army collapsed and Iraq was like, please come back and help. We failed. This is why these kinds of issues matter. It's not just an isolated, we don't like Iran. Iran has actively gone out of their way to kill Americans. I remember sitting in the embassy when all this is happening, and Fair says it must have felt pretty apocalyptic. It felt very apocalyptic. We just all thought we were going to get Benghazi'd, pretty much. We were scared to death we were going to get Benghazi'd. But we come down here, and this is the embassy, by the way. You can see this right here. This is the wonderful street. This is, oh Jesus, that is not Jalalabad Street. It's Al-Kindi Street, I want to say. I don't know. It won't let me click on it to tell you. Anyway, so all of this is happening, and we hear, General Qassam al-Soleimani is coming to Baghdad, or we heard, that he had come to Baghdad. And I was actually standing post when this happened. It was late at night, and I heard two large booms. And keep in mind, we'd been shelled at this point. They were actively shooting rockets at us. And I thought, oh, great, we're about to take some shelling, wait for the IDF alarm to head off, to actually hit off and We saw some flares off in the distance, which, as you saw in some of those photos, the Apaches were popping flares over us, but it was off in the distance, not above us like it had been for the last 2 or 3 days. And, you know, the next morning on CNN, you know, a couple hours later, the United States says we have, you know, killed General Qasem al-Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport, which is about 5 miles away over here. So when this happens, there's a lot of uproar. You know, a lot of people are talking about, you know, hey, you know, he was on a diplomatic mission. What happened about diplomatic immunity? All these things. The U.S. Embassy was almost completely overrun. You know who else happened to be in the car with Qasem al-Soleimani when he got into the vehicle at Baghdad International Airport? The second leading man in charge of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the largest one of which being Kataib Hezbollah, who was currently assaulting the U.S. Embassy. And had been for the last 48 hours. Breached its perimeter. I don't agree with a lot of things politically speaking, but the U.S. does. But the only regret that I have about having General al-Soleimani get killed, to be annihilated with a Predator strike, the only regret that I ever have about it is the fact we couldn't do it twice. Hundreds of Americans have been killed because of this man. Think about the entire insurgency in Iraq. And a lot of that perpetual cycle of insurgency was caused by that man. The attack on the embassy that was making headlines at that time was caused by that man. The reason it was attacked, the reason it was shelled, the reason we bombed Kataib Hezbollah to begin with is because they killed a contractor up in Erbil. Because Kataib Hezbollah had shelled him. That was the outrage. It was because we had bombed. That's why they protested. Is because we had bombed a bunch of ammunition depots for Kataib Hezbollah. They're Iranian backed. Why else would they put up Sadr's giant face on a giant, like, 3-story high poster across in the embassy while they're trying to burn down its gatehouses? Who would then later, not but 2 years later, try several times to overthrow the Iraqi government, to include attempting to storm the presidential palace, and attempting to, and successfully storming the parliament building. So it's not a straightforward thing. It's not a straightforward plan. It's not as easy as just going, put a bunch of sanctions and everything on Iran. And they're trying to develop nuclear weapons. Most of their nuclear weapons program is run by the Russians because that was leaked with many terabytes of information. Thank you for showing that to me. By hackers in Iran who were against the government. They're brutally suppressed their own people. They gas their own, or they have literally poisoned a bunch of school children. They have brutally beaten and murdered morality police. Just think about that. Morality police. I find a lot of people to be immoral. I'd be pretty terrible, I think, as a morality police. It's a good thing I don't have that here. They've tried to kill Americans. They try to instigate fighting. They purposely destabilize the entire region. They are smuggling weapons. They're already sanctioned. They already have an embargo. Like, every, meaningful means against Iran has already been done outside of just going to war with Iran, which there's enough justifications to do so. But it's a bad idea. Why should we? Why should we invade? Most of the Iranian people don't want this. Most of the Iranian people don't want war or violence or what their government's doing. But their government's very suppressive. It's a very oppressive regime. It's a very oppressive, theocratic regime that has constantly aligned itself with dictatorships and horrendous other regimes, to include Korea and Russia and Belarus. See the theme? But the only people they don't get along with was Afghanistan, and even they have some pacts together. Coming out of Mazar-e Sharif in Afghanistan, IED blast has caused more than 30 separate casualties. An IED blast rocked a cultural center in Mazar-e Sharif. The target of the attack was were Shiites and journalists. At least 30 people were killed and injured in the center, with the center reporting at least 3 dead and 30 wounded, including 15 separate journalists. The attack took place after the appointment of the interim governor, who is intended to once again show the inability, who has now shown the inability to provide of the new regime to provide security. The incident was condemned by Iran, which sponsors the cultural center, and by the United Nations. See some of the remnants of that blast. Sorry, by the way, if that very long, overly wrong rant didn't actually answer your question. It's just way too complicated to be straightforward, is really what I'm getting at. Sri Lanka continues to rebuild. We do have this update on Sri Lanka after a very long time of not talking about them. But Sri Lanka does continue rebuilding. After horrendous national crises as of poor government spending, or as a result of poor government spending and energy infrastructure issues, the government of Sri Lanka, while far from recovered, has taken great lengths to recover. Continual meetings with regional partners have calmed populations after a violent protests last year. One of the key points for Sri Lanka was moving forward to not only becoming more financially sustainable, but also to improve their infrastructure with forward-thinking policies such as green energy. Currently, the nation is heavily reliant on imports of diesel fuel to run the energy infrastructure throughout the country. And you see this from a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka. Going off the coast of Mozambique and Malawi, a Cyclone Freddy did make its second landfall over the weekend. So the powerful tropical cyclone Freddy made its second landfall on the coast of Mozambique and parts of Malawi over the weekend. While little information is currently available, the United Nations, through its Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and World Food Program, have put out a call for immediate aid and assistance to the region, citing widespread flooding and devastation to local communities. These issues come alongside major cholera outbreaks in the region, which could be significantly worsened by the heavy rains and flooding. See that coming here from the United Nations. Bring that, what's going on there in Malawi. Coming from the World Food Program. You can see some of that heavy flooding we're talking about. Nemi Heita, who is the head of the International Federation of the Red Cross Maputo delegation. They're estimating that over 500,000 people are going to be at risk. This is coming from the Malawi Red Cross Society.
Hi, Mitch.
Unfortunately, a lot of damage and flooding there as a result. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, at least 2 massacres have happened in the last 4 days. At least 36 people were killed during an overnight attack on the village of Mukondi. The assailants were believed to be members of the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, a Ugandan armed group based in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo that has pledged allegiance to the Islamic State and wages frequent deadly raids on villages. And we do have a follow-up from Al Jazeera. YBC News is also reporting the fact that the second attack took place in Kandera town, killing at least 19 people and set fire to a health center and homes. The government were also suspected to be ADF members. Congo's authorities say people were slaughtered with guns, knives, and machetes. BAKHMUT, a news agency linked to the Islamic State group, posted a statement Saturday in which the Islamic State claimed responsibility for the killing of more than 35 Christians, quote-unquote, and wounding dozens in the eastern Congo throughout last week. So unfortunately, we do continue to see the Islamic State and their reign of terror there in the continent of Africa. Another tropical cyclone, this time Cyclone Yaku, impacted northern Peru in the Piura region. Heavy rains led to overflowing rivers. 4 have died in 2,077 homes, 13 educational centers, and 35 health establishments have so far been damaged. More than 580 districts of the north coast and mountains are at risk due to torrential rains. And we finish off the night with something that I know has concerned a lot of people when you start to hear the words of banks fail in 2008. But I did a little bit of reading because I was very curious into this too. And the news here is about the address today. Biden reassures depositors that their savings are safe. After an emergency Congress Zoom meeting late last night, Democratic and Republican leaders have come out reassuring Americans that their savings are safe and that swift actions are being taken to prevent a domino-style effect after the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank out of New York, which is the newest one added to the list.
Americans can rest assured that our banking system is safe. Your deposits are safe.
And coming from the White House as well, speaking on that. And so I think it might be worth noting kind of what happened, because I read into this a little bit. We'll do the FDIC bank fail. So this is coming from the FDIC for you guys. This is a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So this is the federal insurance, like federal level insurance for banks. And this is, talking about bank failures and what has happened. So they have a failed bank list that they maintain. And the last 2 so far, Silicon Valley Bank failed March the 10th, which was Friday, which we covered on that stream. But we also have on March 12th, which is when Signature Bank, the newest bank, also went under in New York. And a lot of people were, wondering how did these banks fail, all these things. So they didn't truly fail in the sense of the 2008 version of fail. So if we go and we actually click on Silicon Valley Bank, what ends up happening is they say on Friday, March 10th, Silicon Valley Bank was closed by the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, and the FDIC was named receiver. No advance notice was given to the public when financial institution is closed. To protect depositors, on Monday, March 13th, the FDIC transferred all the deposits, both insured and uninsured, of the Silicon Valley Bank to Silicon Valley Bank N.A., a full-service bridge bank that will be operated by the FDIC as it markets and the institution for potential bidders. So for someone to be, so for someone to take over those debts as a business investment. So it's not the sense of this bank made a bunch of poor financial decisions and it straight failed like 2008. It's talking about the safety measures that were put in because of 2008, which is exactly what we see here. We go to Signature Bank, the latest one to fail. And they say that on Sunday, March 12th, 2020, or 2023, Signature Bank was closed by the New York State Department of Financial Services, and the FDIC was named receiver. No advance notice is given to the public when a financial institution is closed to protect depositors. The FDIC has transferred all deposits substantially to Signature Bank to SignatureBank.NA, a full-service bank that operated by the FDIC, and to the market institutions for potential bidders. Basically saying the federal government has taken over those bids. And the reason this is happening is they end up, the bank makes poor financial decisions. They do all sorts of these things, and 2008 happens, and it affects everybody. The whole economy is destroyed. And what ends up happening because of 2008 is the federal government goes, we can't let that happen again. We can't just let bank after bank after bank after bank after bank get fail and have to be bailed out and cost a lot of taxpayer money. So the U.S. government puts in place these, one, they have stricter regulations and stricter control and regulate, and they have federal, they're federally watching these as regulators because, they have the authority to close these banks both at the state level and at the national level because they're federally insured. They're insured by the government. When the government owns part of something that you have to do, it's usually going to mean that you're probably, you're screwed if you screw up. So in order to prevent it becoming a 2008 situation, it's a fail-safe. So the government went in, they saw that there were issues, and before it could become an actual big issue, the government for California and New York went in and said, they've triggered our fail-safes, we're closing this bank down, you're being transferred, all the assets are going to be transferred to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation until they can get a bidder because you're all fired and because you don't know how to run a bank, and we're not going to let you ruin the rest of the economy. It is likely that we will see other banks fail as well that will also be shut down via this fail-safe. This is something other people are watching for now. These banks are failing because they're making poor financial decisions. The government is going in, firing everyone before it becomes a huge problem and screws everyone over again, like 2008. And are now, going through and also, once again, they're checking the other banks in the U.S. who are likely also going to be under the scrutiny of regulators because these banks are going to be operating in the same way, which means they're also going to be making some of the same financial decisions that these banks did as well. So, is it a problem? Yes. Is it likely going to affect you like is it the next 2008 recession? No. From everything I have read, coming from the FDIC, from Silicon Valley Bank, from Signature Bank and their statements and everything that's talking about transfers and other articles that have come out about it, it is not 2008 happening. It is the government preventing 2008 from happening. Those fail-safes, those measures that they put in to ensure that never happens again are working, which is a good thing. Hopefully. Because we've never had to see it before. If you look at the failed bank list, you can see that this isn't the first time it's happened. Equity Bank failed you see a lot of in 2020 in late 2019 when the pandemic really kicks in. You see that there's a lot of failures one right after the other. Almena State Bank, First City Bank of Florida, First State Bank, the First State Bank, Erickson State Bank, or State Bank. All these things, they failed in early 2020, right as the pandemic was hitting the United States. 4 separate banks, you never heard about it. 2 of them in October of 2020. So there's fail-safes there. Silicon Valley Bank just happens to be the largest one since 2008, but it's not an uncommon occurrence. You can see it happens, every other year, every couple of years. There are some banks that fail, but these are safety measures that have been put in place to prevent 2008 from happening again. I think is what I'm saying. What I'm trying to really hammer home here, because there's a lot of people stirring up. Oh no, it's a recession. Crypto's gonna, all my crypto's gonna go down the drain, which I don't find crypto to be worth anything anyway. The stock market, the Dow is down, the Nasdaq's down, like everyone's losing their minds. The housing bubble hasn't popped, but why? Which no one has figured that one out. Why aren't CDOs called a CDO anymore? Margin Call is a fantastic movie if you've ever seen it. But it's not. As of right now, from everything I've read and everything I've seen, there's no reason to panic, and you shouldn't let other people make you try to panic. The fail-safes are, as of right now, working. As far as I know, as far as I can read. I'm not an economic expert. I'm not claiming to ever have been. I think economics is cool, but I don't touch. You have to go to college for that. But yeah, so that's the thing. But outside of that, that is actually all of the news for tonight. Fair just said, Australia and Biden just announced the sale of nuclear subs to Australia. American firepower. But outside of that, I hope everyone here is learned something. I hope that everyone found at least tonight knowledgeable. I'm sorry it was a long one, but 72 hours of news and review, so it's okay. That you, your family, and your friends remain safe, and if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. And if you could, please be sure to check out the video description below and check out all of the wonderful organizations that are down there. Help support all of those organizations. They're doing amazing work. And if you can't give a lot to those organizations, give a little. And if you can't give anything at all, that's okay. I totally understand. But help us try and grow this project so that way we can reach more people, bring more awareness, have more good conversations about what's going on in the world and about the different details and stuff, and also try and help as many people as possible by bringing as many people here that can donate, and hopefully being able to get to the point where we can put fundraisers on every single one of these streams and on every single video. In the meantime, I hope that you guys have a fantastic night. I hope to see you back here at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central on Wednesday for another 48 hours of news and review. My name is Paul from the New News, and have a fantastic night, everybody. Bye now.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Після до ваги і чудно кличе, діти нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлейфуйло. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Після до ваги і чудно кличе, діти нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям мечом, даже танки и бочок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Після до ваги і чудно кличе, діти нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your number 11, shove it up your wrinkle bomb. Oh, we'll come and help you fit it in your skull.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Після до ваги і чудно кличе, діти нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Після до ваги і чудно кличе, діти нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Russian soldiers going home. Бо ми всіх вас змішаємо спагно. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе, ідіть нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо спагно. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе, ідіть нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Ідіть нахуй.